Hello, I'm Christopher Brennan, Associate Editor of the Moscow Times. We're here again with Opinion Editor of the Moscow Times, Michael Bohm, discussing the topic of this week's article, Anti-Americanism, something that's close to both Mike and I as Americans. So in the piece you start off with this poll from Gallup saying that a huge number of Russians say that the United States, is the biggest threat to world peace. In other countries, the U.S. is also a threat, kind of not so much as Russia, where it is 54%,
right,
compared to 24% for the entire world at large, from 67 countries. So, I mean, there's two different types of questions and kind of complaints when someone like yourself writes a very pro-America article, kind of defending against this anti-Americanism that is in Russia. One is...
I don't know if it's pro-American.
One is
why is it pro-American?
Is the thought that America is the largest threat to world peace false in Russia's mind? You say that the Kremlin kind of pumps this up. There's a wonderful cartoon in our paper kind of showing this pump up of fear about America and from the Statue of Liberty. Is that false, given American foreign policy?
My whole point in the article is that this is not the first time that in this poll that countries have considered America a threat. The average is about 24%, as you mentioned, and that's pretty consistent for the last 15 or 20 years. What made the whole poll interesting and why I wrote about it is that Russia's results at 54% are more than twice the global average. And the question is, why is that? Why is it twice, not only the global average, but twice the results of Iraq and Afghanistan? Two countries where America led an invasion in the last... If there's two countries that should see the U.S. as a threat, it's Iraq and Afghanistan. Why are Russia's results twice as much as Iran, where the slogan to this day, despite the warming of relations, is death to America?
I mean, during the Cold War, the idea of dualism, kind of the Soviet Union versus the U.S., as well as kind of anti-U.S. rhetoric all over the Soviet Union. But the U.S., I mean, some of the criticisms or the conspiracy theories that you list in your article talk about really central on regime change, of that America, U.S. business interests, etc., want to turn Russia into a vassal of the U.S., kind of take all of its natural resources. And the inevitable comments that are going to come after this piece and that have come up in various speeches the Moscow Times have published is, does America view regime change as something that happens all the time? Would the U.S. like regime change in Russia, and is that kind of completely unwarranted?
Would America like regime change in Russia? That's the question, right?
Yes.
I think it's a moot question because there's nothing the U.S. can do, even in their wildest dreams.
Okay.
I mean, it's one thing, perhaps, in Georgia. The U.S. can exert more control, but the question is how much, and that's where Russia blows this out of proportion. I mean, if you ask Russians, and if you watch Russian television, they'll tell you that it was the Americans that brought Ukrainians out on the street in 2004 in the Orange Revolution. They paid the Ukrainians, and they're saying that right now.
U.S. politicians sometimes do enter into this sphere of former Soviet influence. John McCain did go to the Maidan in Ukraine and advocate for basically the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, or kind of a transitioning away from the government that was supposedly elected.
But John McCain is not the U.S. government. John McCain is one senator who happens to have a thing about Russia. I mean, it's perfectly clear. He's
There's the idea that he's a Cold Warrior.
Yeah, and
stuck into.
He's stuck on Russia for some reason. He found his little quirk.
So then the criticism is Russia inflates this fear of America. Is the same thing being done on the American side? When Mike Rogers, a Republican from Michigan, said that Snowden was working with the Russians the entire time.
Again, who's Mike Rogers? Did you know who Mike Rogers was before you read the article?
He's the head of the Intelligence Committee of the House of Representatives.
But did you know who Mike Rogers was before you read it? I didn't know who he was. Yes. I never heard of him.
And a lot of these conspiracy theories are coming from people like Vladimir Zhirinovsky of the Liberal Democratic Party, saying that there's...
If it were only limited to Zhirinovsky, it would be like Mike Rogers. It would be like
what is different?
My point is that it's actively pursued and whipped up by the Kremlin on television. Okay. And I listed all 10 examples of what I've seen. And I haven't seen it all because I can't possibly. I mean, I try to watch as many of these programs, pseudo-documentaries as I can, just to gauge the mood. I haven't seen them all. I've seen most of them. But that's the point. And that's why Russia's figures were 54%. And that's why in America it's only 2%. Because when you have just one John McCain or one Mike Rogers, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to manipulate or affect public opinion. But when Russians, who get most of their information from television, turn on the television and get bombarded with, it was the Americans that sent the meteorite over Chelyabinsk. It was the Americans that...
I mean, part of that is also the idea of a double standard still persists and will likely persist in a lot of people's minds. Because when someone like Russian Duma members go to the U.S. in the run-up to a possible intervention in Syria and lobby Republican Congress members to oppose intervention, right, there's kind of a big uproar as well. And you can imagine, okay,
actually,
McCain goes to...
There wasn't much of an
There was a
uproar.
lot of articles kind of in more conservative outlets saying this is Russia kind of invading our turf.
You talking about Syria?
I'm talking about the run-up to Syria. Syria, when Duma members wanted to lobby Republican Congress people.
Yeah, and they turned it down.
Yes, John Boehner was completely, the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, was completely against it.
It wasn't very nice, but...
Kind of as an idea of possible Russian intervention in domestic affairs, what Russia always talks about. Speaking on a global scale, it's hard to answer for everyone in the world and what they're thinking. But you think, I mean, if there is this idea of a more, not really aggressive, but assertive Russia on the world stage, why isn't that number increasing?
Well, again, it depends on who you ask. Some Russians...
I mean, this is asking the world.
No, but we're breaking it down. The poll also broke down among Russians. Among Russians who answer. Among Americans about Russia.
Yeah.
2% of Americans, which coincides with the global average, think Russia is the greatest. Only 2%. It's very low. And as I was saying, some Russians are very happy with that because especially in a year where Russia was presented as a peacemaker.
But I mean, the top ones for America are.
But the
Iran,
other half,
Afghanistan,
the other half,
places that are demonized by American media.
That's one part. Then there are other Russians who are very disappointed with 2% because they are acting on the principle of if the world fears us, they respect us. It's an old Soviet principle. It's a principle that served as a source of patriotism during the Soviet years. 2%. What's 2%? 2%.
I mean, people would say that the Russian regime is kind of looked upon well in the eyes of the world. Critics of your idea would say that they are looked upon well and viewed as a resurgent power, as kind of a counterbalance to the U.S. rather than.
Some Russians feel that. Other Russians feel that they'd rather be feared, and that is respect. For example, in 2008, Russia's figure was 6%. 6% of the world feared Russia,
which happened to coincide with Russia's most kind of recent use of military force.
Right.
So
it was a
again,
direct result.
When we talk about people who are using military force throughout the world, the number one user of military force in the world right now would be the U.S., which perhaps explains why they lead the poll.
Except under Obama, they act militarily only with the sanction of with the approval of the UN. I'm not sure Russians, a lot of conservative Russians, like that even as a peacemaker, because once they sit quietly on the sidelines, they're unnoticed. And I think particularly because of the Soviet legacy, when everybody noticed the Soviet Union, half the world was scared of the Soviet Union, meaning, which also means that half the world.
I don't think we have numbers on that, but.
Which means that half the world respected in a very distorted way. But I think the Soviet Union took what they could get. But so the 2%, I think Russians are split over the 2%. Some see it as a plus, some see it as a minus.
Well, Mike, thank you for coming on again today. I'm sure discussions of both America and Russia will continue into the future on our website, on other websites, in your column.
Especially Anti-Americanism. We'll see much more.
We'll see much more. And we'll see you again next time on Opinion Roundup.